60 Minutes is constantly on the lookout for places we've never been before. So when our late colleague Bob Simon heard about a magical place in the Hebrides Islands off the coast of Scotland, known for making some of the great whiskies in the world, well, the story spoke to him. The place is called Islay, and it's one of 5 whiskey-producing regions in Scotland that make an expensive type of Scotch called single malt. Islay's distilleries turn out relatively small amounts of their own handcrafted brands for a worldwide luxury market that's more than doubled in size in the last decade and become the spirit equivalent of the fine wine business. Bob liked good Scotch and beautiful places, so he went off to Scotland. He died before he could finish the piece, leaving behind a stack of videotapes and some random notes. We decided to finish it for him and raise a glass in his memory. Islay is a small island 20 miles off the west coast of Scotland. There are few trees, miles of windswept heather, and some of the most fertile agricultural land in Scotland. There are sheep and cattle everywhere and an abundance of wildlife. But that's not why people come here. This is 8 small distilleries that produce some of the world's finest single malt whiskies.
This is the whole lifeblood of this island and everybody on it. This is all we know.
Jim McEwen has been working at Islay's distillery since he was 15 years old. He's now master of the works at Bruichladdich.
I just thank God that he chose the Scots and gave them whiskey, because we appreciate the gift and we look after it.
They've been making it here since the 15th century, when supposedly some monks taught the locals how to use barley, water, and yeast to make a spirit the Scots now call the water of life. They've been perfecting it for 600 years. The distilleries are easy to find, but hard to pronounce. Ardbeg, Bamore, Bruichladdich, Bunnahabhain, Colilla, Kilchoman, Lagavulin, and Lefroy. As Bob Simon noted, they get harder to pronounce the more you visit.
For us guys on the west coast of Scotland, whiskey is a religion because it's a provider. And the great thing about whiskey is not just a drink, it's much more than that. Have you ever watched some old Hollywood movies?
Yes, I have.
Scotch was always portrayed in Hollywood as a whiskey when you were down or you were in trouble. The one thing that was going to get you back on your feet and out there was a Scotch.
Today, if you're down on your luck, you probably can't afford an Islay single malt. The good ones start at around $70 a bottle. The rare ones can go for hundreds of dollars a glass at chic whiskey bars around the world, where they're known for their distinctive smoky taste. It comes from peat, the mossy earthen fuel that's cut from bogs on the island. It was used to heat Scottish homes for centuries and is still used to toast the barley at Islay distilleries. John Campbell is the master distiller at Lefroy, one of the top-selling single malts in America.
Peat is the thing that makes Islay unique, and it really resonates with people, and it just engenders a kind of love-hate relationship, and the people that love it absolutely love it with a passion.
And there seems to be no shortage of them. Islay is not easy to get to, usually requiring multiple flights, a long drive, and a 2-hour ferry ride. Yet enthusiasts continue to make the pilgrimage, especially for the Whiskey Festival.
We get literally thousands upon thousands of single malt tourists coming here. They come from all over the world just to set foot on Islay.
To study it?
No, to drink it. It's lovely. It's clean, it's fresh, it's vibrant.
Officially, Whiskey Fest is a celebration of Islay's culture, but mostly it's about drinking.
Absolutely beautiful. No off notes at all.
As they listen to Jim McEwen extol the virtues of Bruichladdich, the novitiates, connoisseurs, and whiskey snobs approached each glass with reverence bordering on the religious.
Oh, wow. The fruit in that is incredible.
As the glasses empty, the smiles got bigger. But the Islanders will tell you that all of this warmth and good feeling comes not from the alcohol in the spirits, but from the spirit of the place. It is almost mystical, beautiful, dramatic, and quiet. There's no road rage, barely any traffic. If you do get hung up, it's probably because of a farm animal. They have the right of way. And if you do happen upon people, they'll almost always greet you with the Islay wave.
So everybody just waves because it's just friendly. There's not so many of us, so you just wave to say hi.
It's what Ailsa Hayes liked about the island when she moved her family here from London to take a manager's position at one of Islay's thriving distilleries.
It's strange, is it not, that such a small place with so few people, your products are known everywhere in the world.
I know, but it makes us all very proud, it does. There's such a boom worldwide for single malts. It's fantastic, and you can really feel that on the island. A lot of the distilleries have doubled production, and so there's a lot of opportunities there as well.
And there's no reason to believe that that won't continue.
Well, times are good, people drink. Times are bad, people drink.
Is it possible to be socially acceptable to be a teetotaler on this island?
Yes.
Are there any?
Yes. No, I'm not one of them.
Over the years, the island's people have learned how to entertain themselves, often at gatherings called ceilidhs, which feature traditional dance and sad songs, mostly about leaving Islay and yearning to return.
To sit with my love on the bridge above the rippling waterfall, to go back home, never more to roam, is my dearest wish of all.
If this looks and feels a lot like Ireland, that's no coincidence. It's only 25 miles away. They come from the same tribe, share the same Celtic culture and Gaelic language, not to mention a love of good whiskey that gets them through stormy weather and the long winter nights. There are no movie theaters on Islay, no dry cleaners, no supermarkets, no McDonald's, at least in the fast food business. Jim McEwen says there's a long list of things that Islay doesn't have and doesn't want.
We don't have any crime. We don't have mugging, carjacking, housebreaking, rape, just dope, drugs. We don't have that. You can keep that. You're very welcome to it.
How do you explain the fact that there's no crime here? There's crime everywhere else.
If you commit a crime in a small community, you will be ostracized and have to leave. Not only that, your family, your children and your children's children will be remembered as the children of the man who committed the crime.
Most Scots are forthright, practical people who are proud of their country and the fact that their most famous export has withstood the test of time. They see themselves as artisans, and making whiskey is more about art and alchemy than manufacturing. Every distiller has their own secrets and superstitions. We'll give you the unclassified 2-minute tour. Sorry, we can't offer you free samples. It begins with a bit of trickery on the malting floor, when barley that's been soaked in water is spread out and raked over and over to convince the grain it's spring and time to germinate, releasing the starches that are locked inside. It's then dried with peat smoke to add flavor and ground into flour, sometimes with 19th century machinery, and then mixed with hot water, transforming the starches into a sugary concoction called mash.
Smell that, Bob.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't that, you can smell the goodness.
Yeast is then added, changing the sugar into alcohol, a primitive ale, which is then cooked a couple of times in copper stills, where the vapor is collected and condensed into this clear liquid.
And that's the stuff we want to go into the barrel.
But what I'm looking at is this looks like rubbing alcohol. This is in fact a whiskey.
It's very good. If you need a rub, there's no doubt about it.
I bet it would be good. But once it goes into the barrel, from then it's just time.
It's just time. And it's a great journey, you know. This is a child, but the cask is the mother. And that's what makes the journey. If you give a good cask, you're bound to get a good child. It's that simple.
It takes less than 3 weeks to make, but requires at least 10 years of aging in these oak casks, which add flavor and color to turn it into world-class single malt whiskey.
You'll see some of the names. There's Claremont Springs, Buffalo Trace, Jim Beam.
Bob was surprised to learn that 97% of the casks used to make single malt whiskey had been previously used to age American bourbon and bought secondhand from U.S. distillers. It's testimony to the ingenuity and frugality of the Scots, who have very few oak trees.
Without the American barrel, there would be no whiskey industry. It's as simple as that.
A sophisticated palate will detect a hint of the oak and bourbon in Islay's single malt, as well as the sweetness of sherry that comes from wine casks bought in Europe. Before the final product is sold, it will have done time in a number of different casks. Master distiller Jim McEwen is the one who decides when to rotate them and when each barrel is ready to be bottled. He opened a young cask for Bob to sample.
I would describe that as mellow yellow, absolutely pure.
And it's only 7 years old.
That's right. Young whiskies are like young people. They're vibrant, they're full of life. In fact, this for me is like coming home from work. At the end of the day, I work really hard. Nobody appreciates me. My wife doesn't appreciate me. My kids don't appreciate me. Life's a bitch.
Couple of glasses of that and it doesn't matter.
A couple of shots of that and I am the king of the world.
Absolutely. You know, frankly, I never liked this stuff, but the way you're talking me into it.
But you got to check every barrel.
I certainly hope so. Cheers.
McEwen is the man responsible for the taste and consistency of the whiskeys at Bruichladdich, which requires a very personal involvement with the product.
I have heard you described as the cask whisperer.
I do talk to casks, there's no doubt about it.
In what language?
Mainly English, and it depends how many whiskies I've had. If I've had a few whiskies, I tend to revert to the Gaelic language, so I'm talking to the cask. It's just one of these things, you go into the warehouse and you pop the bung out, and you draw your sample, yeah, and you look at it and you think, wow, you're beautiful. But you're not just ready yet. Tell you what, I'm going to come back and see you in 3 months, okay? And other times you find a cask which is so incredibly good, you can't not speak. You say, oh my God, you are the most beautiful thing I have ever tasted in my life. You know, and you think, oh jeez, I just want to share this with somebody. But there's nobody around, there's just me and the cask.
We'll stay.
On most days, McEwen devotes several hours to quality control, checking up on several hundred casks.
But it's a fantastic job, nosing and tasting whiskies.
And you can still walk out of here in the evening.
Occasionally I need some help, there's no doubt about that, yeah.
Dying devotion to one's whiskey is apparently not all that unusual. While we were on Islay, the camera crew ran into a party of Canadians, the friends and family of a deceased single malt lover named Bill, who wanted his ashes scattered in the waters opposite his favorite distillery. Funds for the pilgrimage were set aside in his will.
That's what I wanted. It's good, it's good. To Bill.
Bill, Angela.
Now he's happy. Now he's happy.
After that, the only thing left was for Bob to say goodbye to Jim McEwen, and it turned out to be last call for our old pal, Bob Simon.
Cheers, Bob. Hope you've enjoyed this little visit here.
You're speaking in the past, it's not over.
Yeah, I'm going to get you out of here, man. This is you're costing me a fortune.
The relationship between Cuba and the United States was stuck in pretty much the same bad place for half a century. But things have been changing at a dizzying pace in the last couple of years. President Obama started the thaw in the relationship by reestablishing diplomatic relations and easing restrictions on travel. Now, President-elect Trump is threatening to undo all those moves, and Fidel Castro, who spent 50 years poking his thumb in the eye of every American president, has died. Whatever happens, there's already a war underway that has the U.S. and Cuba on the rocks. It's a war over rum, specifically over two different versions of Havana Club Rum, and it's as bitter as the Cold War ever was.
It's a Tuesday afternoon at El Floridita in Old Havana, and we and lots of other visitors to Cuba are filing in and filling up at the bar that calls itself the cradle of the daiquiri. Head bartender Alejandro Bolivar needs to double up on rum bottles just to keep up with demand.
How many bottles do you go through a day?
It's between 60 and 80 bottles per day.
That's a lot of daiquiris.
Yeah, plenty of empty bottles.
Oh my gosh.
And we also...
Is this just from today?
Yeah, today, yeah.
All those bottles were filled with Havana Club Rum, produced by a 50-50 joint venture between the Cuban government and the French beverage giant Pernod Ricard, which sent Jerome Cotin-Bizon to Cuba to run the business. We met him in a place that's rarely open to outsiders, a warehouse stacked to the ceiling with oak barrels full of rum.
We've built a very great success with Havana Club. When we started the partnership in 1993, we sold 5 million bottles a year. Today we sell 50 million bottles a year.
50 million bottles, 11 million of them sold here in Cuba. The tourists drinking Havana Club are obvious. But we went looking down the side streets and found locals drinking it too, at domino games and dance halls and discos, and sipping it along Havana's seafront promenade, the Malecon. To distill and age all that rum, the Cuban government and Pernod Ricard rely on Asbel Morales, Havana Club's master rum maker. He loves talking about rum, but he says to really understand it, you have to drink it.
Sí, cómo no.
Es muy bueno.
Muy bueno. El primer trago, nosotros le decimos trago, sorbo.
The first sip will impact you the most, he said, and make you anxious for a second.
I am anxious to continue the second sip.
And the third and the fourth.
We don't have anything else to do today, do we?
And the Cohiba cigar that he says pairs perfectly with this Havana Club. As we drank and smoked, Morales told me Cubans are born with a rum gene. And to be real Havana Club rum, he said, it must be made from Cuban sugarcane and aged in the hot and sticky Cuban climate.
Here's where it gets confusing. This is another bottle of Havana Club rum. Exact same name, but you can see right here, this one is made in Puerto Rico, and it's made by Bacardi. How in the world can you say Havana Club when you're making it in Puerto Rico?
Just the way that you say, I'm calling it Arizona iced tea, and I'm not making it in Arizona.
Rick Wilson is an executive at Bacardi, originally a Cuban company, and now the largest privately held liquor business in the world.
The true Havana Club, made with the recipe of the original founders, is the Havana Club that Bacardi is making and selling here in the United States.
Bacardi bought that original recipe from the family of this woman, Amparo Arechabala.
And it was one of the wealthiest families in Cuba before the revolution.
Definitely.
The Arechabala fortune was built on sugar and shipping and rum, Havana Club rum. Like hundreds of other Cuban companies, theirs was confiscated shortly after Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959.
They took over the company on December 31st, 1959.
And do you remember that day?
I remember that day vividly. My husband came home. He went to work early, and then he came home and he says, they've thrown us out. It's over.
It's over, he said.
He said, it's over.
All of their assets gone, Amparo and her husband Ramon were ordered to leave Cuba with only the clothes on their backs.
And how much money did you have in your pockets?
Absolutely nothing. Nothing, nothing, nothing.
What was it like when you got on the plane?
Everybody in the entire plane was crying. And I remember I looked out the window as we were taking off, and I say to my husband, take a good look because you're not going to see it again.
In Cuba, the Arechabalas and Bacardi had been competitors, each making and selling popular brands of rum. But when the revolution came, Rick Wilson says Bacardi had an advantage.
Bacardi, unlike most other Cuban families and companies, had assets outside of Cuba.
Is that the reason they were able to survive?
Yes, because we could continue to produce and sell our product, unlike the Arechabalas. The Arechabalas, everything they had was in Cuba, everything.
Everything except the recipe for Havana Club rum. The Arechabalas eventually sold it to their old rival Bacardi, which makes this version at its distillery in Puerto Rico. They did it to compete with this version, made by the Cuban government and their partner Pernod Ricard. That set off the longest bar fight ever.
It has been fought both in the courts, where the latest lawsuit is pending, and the marketplace between two of the world's largest liquor companies. Pernod Ricard produces Absolute Vodka, Chivas Regal Scotch, Beefeater Gin. Bacardi makes Grey Goose Vodka,
Dewar Scotch, and Bombay Sapphire Gin. And now they both make Havana Club Rum, and they both try to claim the moral high ground.
And it wasn't that Pernod Ricard had just stepped up and they looked to be a competitor to you.
No, I mean, we don't mind competition from Pernod Ricard or anyone else. Pernod Ricard, though, did and is partnering with the Cuban government, who has confiscated the assets of a family. No compensation paid.
It's hard to believe that a company like Bacardi is just making a moral argument. That it's just
We're not.
about...
We're making a moral and a legal argument.
And the legal argument is?
Theft. I mean, it comes down, it's stolen property. That's what it comes down to.
The Bacardi family will say that this Havana Club is stolen property.
Well, you see the place. We are here in our distillery. It was built in 2007.
And none of these facilities were used before the revolution?
None of these facilities were used before the revolution, no.
And Asbel Morales dismisses the argument that the Havana Club rum he produces for Pernod Ricard in Cuba is not the real thing because it's not made from the original Arechabala family recipe.
Está en esta tierra, está en este clima.
The recipe remains in this land, he said. It is here, in this climate, the culture.
Los cubanos que lo hacen.
Well, it's very simple. To make a Cuban rum, you need to make it in Cuba. You know, it doesn't take more than that. You cannot make a Cuban rum in Puerto Rico.
And the Arechabalas cannot, he insists, claim to own the Havana Club brand decades after abandoning it.
How do you feel that they use that word about the family, saying they abandoned the brand?
They can say whatever they want. They can say that we abandoned. We didn't abandon anything. They threw us out.
The Castro government did that. The French company, Pernod Ricard, came along much later and turned the Cuban Havana Club into a global brand and an icon of Cuban culture.
Havana Club.
We found the logo everywhere we went in Cuba, on every glass in every bar, on taxi drivers and parking attendants, on the chairs we did our interviews in, and at the tourist market, on artwork and tote bags and T-shirts, right alongside other symbols of Cuba.
Do you sell more Che T-shirts or more Havana Club T-shirts?
The same.
About the same.
When we sell a bottle of Havana Club in France, in England, or in Chile, we not only sell the liquid, we sell the soul of the country.
The one place in the world they can't sell their Havana Club at the moment is the United States because of the trade embargo on Cuban products that has been in place since 1962. But there is a way for Americans to have the Cuban version. President Obama recently lifted limits on how much rum and cigars tourists can bring home from Cuba.
Will you be bringing rum home with you? Yes, lots of rum. We stocked up. Now we just need another case to bring it back in.
The makers of Cuban Havana Club aren't satisfied with just sending suitcases full of rum home with tourists. They want to ship containers full when the trade embargo is lifted.
In Cuba, we know how to be patient. Look, all the rum sitting around us, all these barrels. It's years and years of aging, years and years of work, of dedication. We know that one day we'll be able to sell our rum, Havana Club, the true Cuban rum made in Cuba, and that the US consumer will have the chance, the opportunity to enjoy it.
Consumers in the US drink 40% of the world's rum, which explains why they're stacking barrels sky high in Cuba in preparation.
This is all ready to go.
This is all ready to go.
For now, though, the trade embargo continues, and so does the court fight over who has the right to use the Havana Club name. On the streets of Havana, there's no disagreement on that point.
Hola.
We took a few bottles of Bacardi's version there to sample reaction.
Do you drink rum?
Sí.
Have you ever seen this before?
These men we found playing dominoes on an old Havana side street were more than happy to try it.
Similar.
Similar.
It's good, he said, but the Cuban is better quality.
El mejor el cubano.
Color is different. The stamp is different. This is a real Havana Club. It's a symbol.
In a bar called Sloppy Joe's, manager Ernesto Iznaga wanted no part of Bacardi's Havana Club.
You don't even want to try it?
No.
You can just have a sip. You don't have to drink the whole bottle.
No.
No.
Sorry.
These are the front lines, 2 bottling lines in 2 countries, each one producing Havana Club Rum, each claiming that its version is the only real and authentic one. Not so far apart in miles, but worlds apart in the Rum War.
As anyone who's sat through a Thanksgiving dinner can tell you, families can drive you nuts. And if you're bold or crazy enough to go into business together, beware. A recent study found only 15% of family businesses survive the second generation, meaning if the whims of the marketplace don't get you, familial rivalry or plain old-fashioned greed will, which makes the Antinori family of Italy all the more remarkable. They've been in the same line of work for 6 centuries now. The Antinoris make wine, and the family's story reads like something a wine critic might write about their product. Complex, stylish, sophisticated, with a bouquet both elegant and earthy. It's harvest time in the great vineyards of Italy, none greater than the 5,000 acres farmed by the Antinori family. Until recently, Italian business, especially the wine business, was pretty much for men only.
Girls normally in families like ours ended up to be married, possibly happily, and that's it, no need to work.
But Albiera Antinori and her 2 sisters are the first women in 26 generations to play a major role in the family enterprise. Allegra Antinori.
I feel part of the land, you know. I think I'm owned by that land. It's something very, very strong.
From the fields to the cellars, you'll find the Antinori women at work, hoping, as vintners have for centuries, that this year the balance of sun, soil, and rain will produce a vintage for the ages. Alessia Antinori. People use these wonderful words to describe taste. There's personality. What else?
The elegance. The wine has to be elegant. And so you say, how do you describe elegance? You can't. It's like an elegant woman. How you describe her? It's personal.
You know it when you see
exactly,
it.
Exactly.
Their domain stretches from the legendary vineyards of Tuscany and Umbria to their property in California's Napa Valley. Antinori is perhaps the oldest family business on Earth.
The first document which we have, which proves that an ancestor of mine was involved in the wine production, dates back to 1385.
The patriarch and still the godfather is Piero Antinori. He's 70 and bears the noble title of Marchesa. He works behind an antique desk that dates to the Renaissance.
When we have to take some decision regarding the family, we have them here. And my father used to do the same thing.
And in his birthplace, Florence, the city that gave birth to the Renaissance, that flowering of art, science, and the good life, he leads a visitor to a small window to the past. It looks like a confessional. Hundreds of years ago, an Antinori cellar master sat waiting for customers to knock.
The cellar master would pass a bottle of Chianti wine, and he would receive the money back. This has been in operation until a couple of centuries ago.
Recent history by your standards.
Yes, really.
For 623 years, various Antinori have kept the business going despite war, plague, political intrigue, and the shifting tastes of consumers. The family tree shows a bumper crop of Antinori who made their mark, not just in wine, but in every aspect of Italian life.
In business, in politics, in church.
So the family always made sure back then that all bets were covered, correct?
I think it was a bit the concept, yes.
There were poets and priests, rogues and rascals. In 1576, Francesco de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, had one Antinori strangled for his undue attentions to Bianca, the Duke's wife. In the 1700s, another Antinori cultivated Pope Clement XII as an important customer. the pontiff, who commissioned the building of Rome's Trevi Fountain, decided to throw a few coins the Antinori's way.
We have some correspondence saying that the Pope used to like very much the wines of our family and he wanted to order more.
A pretty good recommendation, correct? Especially in the 18th century.
Yes, no doubt.
But the family history lining the shelves of the Marchesa's office says precious little about the wives and daughters in the Antinori family tree, a fact not lost on Albiera, Allegra, and Alessia. Are there any interesting women in those 26 generations?
I'm sure there are some women, but women in history in the past time, even if, unless they were special, they were not really considered
Yes, exactly.
to be mentioned.
It's true, because when I went to Agriculture University in northern Italy, in Milan, we were 2 women, and the rest were all men. Very lucky.
For 6 centuries, command of the Antinori Empire was passed from father to son. But with no male heir, the Marchesa, some years ago, sold a major stake in the business to Whitbread, a British company whose fortune was based on beer making.
It was the period when I didn't know exactly if my daughters would be interested or not to be involved in the business. And so for me that was a way to guarantee a continuity also to the company.
But the partnership produced mainly grapes of wrath. It was a vintage clash between the foaming suds of quick profits and Piero insisting he'd sell no wine before its time. This marriage of inconvenience ended when Piero bought back the shares, keeping Antinori all in the family.
I think he saw us interested and said, why not? What's wrong with girls? And so took his chance, expecting his daughters to fall in love with the business.
And that they did. Now all 3 travel the countryside and the world, helping to grow, promote, and market Antinori wines. They sold 17 million bottles last year, $200 million worth, making a healthy profit. And though the business now involves spreadsheets and science, the basics still come, as they have for centuries, from down on the farm. Even with all this tradition and history and everything else, the family still regards itself as farmers, yes?
Yes, absolutely. This is our origin. Still now, in modern times, we are basically farmers.
We appreciate the nature and the countryside more than the glamorous city life.
You're 3 country bumpkins.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Well, hardly.
Salud. Cheers.
Elegance is the rule at Palazzo Antinori, the family home in Florence. Since the family's wines must be sampled often to ensure quality control, every lunch at the Palazzo is a kind of business lunch. The Marchesa, his wife Francesca, their daughters and sons-in-law, and the grandchildren all may have a say. Any family arguments at this table? Come on, secrets. I want secrets revealed here.
Yes. Sometimes we start with an argument, but after 3 or 4 glasses of wine...
Everything disappears.
This palazzo has been in the family since 1506, both the headquarters of the business and also the residence of the family.
When an Antinori wishes to seek solace, or a place for quiet contemplation, or even a place to confess his earthly sins, it's hardly difficult. Just leave the Palazzo Antinori, and traffic notwithstanding, cross the Piazza Antinori, and within minutes arrive at the Cappella Antinori, the Antinori family chapel, where they might visit the tomb of Alessandro Antinori, one of the founders of the dynasty, and perhaps a nod to any number of Antinoris buried beneath the chapel floor. If wealth and history can buy you one lasting pleasure, it is convenience. Marchesa Antinori, for instance, commutes by air to his most famous vineyard, Tignanello, in the Tuscan countryside south of Florence. Here the family developed the red wines for which they're famous. At his villa here, this is the view the Marchesa wakes up to every morning.
We have the vineyards and the landscape.
But as the experience with the British partners showed, it's no business for the impatient or for those who have a taste for the quick buck. 10 years can pass from the time a new vine is planted until its wine comes to market.
You have to be patient and to wait until the wine is good enough, the vines are old enough to produce a good wine.
Tignanello is but one of the Antinori postcard-perfect estates. Castella della Sala is another, halfway between Rome and Florence. Here, Albiera went to work after high school, living at the family's grand 14th century castle, but learning the wine trade from the bottom up as a field hand in the vineyards. You got your hands dirty.
Yes, I got my hands dirty. It was the first place where I really started to understand what was going on, I mean, the whole process.
But it's not all dirt and business. There's that other estate, Guado El Tasso, on the Tuscan coast.
I did my own stable, my own training track in the middle of the vineyards. I go riding there every morning. It's beautiful. I love it.
It's a very good life you described. Are you spoiled?
Yes, I am very spoiled, but I think we appreciate what we have.
And they are constantly reminded that in this line of work, nature always has the last word. The Antinori found the 2002 crop wasn't up to par and didn't bother bottling most of it.
You cannot force things, you cannot force nature. If you have a bad vintage, tough luck. We can wake it up for a second before we put it back to sleep.
Every few months, they check on the progress of their wine, fast asleep in the cellars. The verdict, let it sleep a while longer.
You see, it's still very young, very rough, has to stay in there for a little while.
Another family meal, another bottle of wine or two. Every once in a while, someone offers to buy them out, but this farmer and his daughters politely decline, on the theory that if family ownership was good enough in 1385, it's good enough today.
It is really our intention to remain a family business because we think that this is the best solution for us.
For at least another 500 years.
At least.
What are the signs of global warming? Glaciers are melting at an increasingly rapid pace. Persistent droughts are spreading. Well, we have another to tell you about, wine, as in what you probably cracked open for Christmas dinner. Farmers who grow the grapes have seen the effects of climate change in the soil, in the roots of the vines, and the yields of their crops. France, a major center of winemaking for centuries, is experiencing increasingly higher temperatures and extreme weather conditions that have damaged vintages and livelihoods. This year was particularly dramatic. France recorded its smallest harvest since 1957 and stands to lose more than $2 billion in sales, a huge blow to the country's second largest export industry. And it's hitting nearly all the wine-growing regions where they make dry whites, fruity reds, and fizzy champagne. All bubblies are called sparkling wine, but champagne is made here and nowhere else in these vineyards and villages of Champagne located in northeastern France. There's a mystique to champagne, an aura of romance. Coco Chanel once said, "I only drink champagne on two occasions, when I'm in love and when I'm not." They've been producing this wine of kings here for centuries. So how long has this winemaking business and the vineyards been in your family?
From 1700.
1700?
Yes.
Christine Sevillano took over the family business and its 20 acres of vines 14 years ago. She's the 10th generation.
This is the cellar of my grandfather.
Oh. After surviving the French Revolution and 2 world wars, her family's house of Pio Sevillano faced its worst year ever in 2021.
We lost 90% of our harvest.
90%?
Yes.
How many bottles were you able to produce this year, as opposed to a normal year?
A normal year, I produce around 50,000 bottles.
This year?
0. It's the first time in the history of my winery that we will not make champagne.
Not a single bottle from this winery?
Yes.
Higher temperatures and extreme weather episodes devastated not only her harvest, but much of Champagne's.
It rained in 2 or 3 days that it rained normally in 1 month. Even my father told me that in his career, he has never seen that.
Almost flood-like?
Yes.
The worst of it, she says, came in June and July, when the heat and the rains resulted in a more crippling outbreak than usual of funguses, like mildew contamination.
In fact, when the grapes are contaminated, the fruit is drying, and after we can use it because there is no juice, nothing.
And you attribute this to climate change?
Yes, because it was so extreme. It's not normal.
This year's extreme weather not only battered Champagne and the foundation of its economy, but nearly every one of the wine-producing regions in France, Burgundy to Bordeaux, where some of the highest quality, best known, and best tasting reds and whites are made. And these are what grape? What?
This is Merlot.
Merlot.
Yes.
I love Merlot.
Yeah, Merlot makes a beautiful, soft, rounded wines.
Jacques Lerton, the head of a wine family dynasty, runs the Chateau La Louvière and several other wineries in Bordeaux. He says vine disease is getting worse all over France because of the rising temperatures.
We don't have winters anymore, almost. In wintertime, normally you get colder conditions. These cool conditions tend to kill the funguses or the disease. So normally, winter cleans the situation, you see. But the most important problem that we have is what we call spring frost.
Spring frost was so severe in April this year that wine growers were on their knees lighting bales of hay and candles between their vines in a mostly futile attempt to protect their young buds.
It is the largest catastrophe we have ever suffered, because before we had some spring frost in some regions, but this is the first time we have it all over France. Now, due to the fact that we don't have these very strong winters, the buds start to open and then expose themselves to this series of spring frost that we have.
And that is the crux of...
And this is what affects the most the quantity of grapes.
So tell us about this year in terms of the amount.
In average, in France this year, a loss of 30%.
30% of the yields. And what about you? What's
and
your
us,
percent?
we have been affected up to 40%.
So you're one of the largest wine producers in Bordeaux. 40% loss, I mean, that's enormous.
It's huge. It's huge.
For Bordeaux, he estimates a loss of roughly $800 million in sales this year. Is this something that's happening all over Europe or just France?
No, it's happening all over Europe, definitely.
Greg Jones is a research climatologist with Southern Oregon University, who for 25 years has specialized in the study of how climate influences the growing and harvesting of wine grapes.
What we're seeing today is we're seeing more of these extreme events happening more frequently at greater degrees and causing more problems.
Yeah, we see it everywhere. It's not just in farm regions. I mean, every part of our country is experiencing some extreme weather condition. So how do you know it isn't that normal extreme weather as opposed to a general climate change?
There's an area in climate science called attribution science, and attribution science is all about trying to kind of understand how much role humans have in the game of climate. So the idea
of who to attribute it to.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And so what climatologists do is we develop models that look at aspects of climate, and those models that are coming out are really telling us more and more that in the absence of humans, most of these things would not occur to the same degree they're occurring today.
Tie what you're saying about climate to what's going on in France now.
Sure. In France, just like most of Europe, temperatures have gone up, summers have gotten drier, and wine grapes are just sensitive. They're sensitive to those kind of changes, and we've been seeing it worldwide, and Europe has been at the epicenter of it.
This weather map of Europe for June 2021, the second warmest June in Europe on record, shows a red band depicting high surface air temperatures stretching across much of the continent. Heat waves were also recorded over western North America in June 2021. Scorching temperatures and drought conditions contributed to wildfires in 2020 around Napa and Sonoma, the center of America's wine industry, where fields were left blackened. In Australia, the bushfires of 2019 and 20 burnt some vineyards to the ground, while smoke ruined the quality of the grapes. In 2017, in Italy, spring frost combined with hailstorms and a heat wave known as Lucifer led to the lowest harvest in decades. Particularly hard hit was northern and central Italy, where Prosecco, Barolo, and Chianti are made. And in parts of Chile and Argentina, higher temperatures are pushing wine growers to plant their vineyards at higher altitudes where temperatures are cooler. Greg Jones says the warming atmosphere is also changing the grape's growth cycle.
It accelerates that ripening to the point that we're picking earlier. For example, 2020 in Burgundy, the picking date was August 20th. And prior to that, we've been averaging for the last 30 years about September 15th. And then for 600 years before that, we were averaging the end of September, 1st of October.
Oh, so it's dramatic.
So it's pretty dramatic.
These pages of parchment documenting harvest dates going back as far as 1354 were found in the Church of Notre Dame in Burgundy. 1354.
It's a wonderful data record that we've been able to look at to better understand what climates were like back then, how it affected harvests, and what that looks like today.
I'm smiling because I'm thinking 1300s. I'm thinking the monks were making wine.
Well, exactly.
The wine industry in France is so vital to the economy that the government has scientists studying ways to adapt and mitigate the changing environment. One route to adaptation is to introduce new grape varieties. Experimental vineyards have been planted with vines from warmer climate countries to see if they can grow here so the grapes can be blended in with the Merlots, Cabernets, and other French wines. Natalie Ola is the director of the project at the Bordeaux Science Institute of Vine and Wine. So you're looking at grapes that come from southern regions that maybe grow better in warmer climates.
Yes.
Like from where?
From Spain, from Portugal, from Greece.
How many are you actually looking at?
So in this experimental vineyard, we are studying 52 different varieties.
They've chosen 6 of those varieties thus far to be planted in Bordeaux. So this is your greenhouse?
Yes, it is.
A second route of adaptation is genetic breeding. Are you actually creating new grapes, new different kinds of grapes?
Yes, the idea is to have grapes, new varieties, which can be resistant to disease and also more adapted to climate change conditions.
And do not compromise the distinctive qualities of the French wines. At the Institute's laboratory, scientists are studying the genetics of wine's color, aroma, and taste. And that's what you're trying to preserve, even as you introduce new grapes.
Yes, I think we want to change without changing, I would say.
Yes. How confident are you that you're going to crack the puzzle? You're going to figure out how to stay ahead of climate change?
All together, with new varieties, new growing practice, I think we can cope with climate change, at least until the middle of the 21st century.
The middle of the century is only 30 years from now.
Yeah.
So you're looking at how fast temperatures are rising, and you're saying it's possible that they will rise above a point.
That it will be much more complicated to keep what we call Bordeaux style and Bordeaux taste.
With all the gloom and doom about warming temperatures in wine country, there's actually a surprising upside. What about quality? What about the taste? What's important about wine? How is climate change affecting that?
Alors, the climate change is affecting the quality very positively.
Positively?
Yes, exactly. We have never seen such a large quantity of good vintages of Bordeaux wines.
Well, explain that. That's counterintuitive.
Thanks to the global warming and the climate change, now we have warmer summers, and which makes that our grapes are ripening better. If we get good warm conditions, we have good color quantity in the skin, but as well, we have the right amount of sugar.
What a painful irony. The taste improves just as the yields are shrinking for winemakers like Christine Sevillano. So more quality, but fewer grapes, dramatically fewer grapes.
Yes, it's crazy.
If you have another year like this one, financially, can you survive?
It will be difficult, really, really difficult. But in the same time, I'm trustful for next year. I mean, I'm trustful. I have to.
Improved taste is not the only unforeseen benefit of climate change for some winemakers. How it's affecting the bubbly you're likely to enjoy on New Year's Eve when we return. For some wine growers, climate change has been a disaster, as we've seen. But as it turns out, climate change has been a boon for others. While higher temperatures have hurt growers in France and Italy, for instance, places that historically have been too cold to produce quality wines are now turning out consistently good ones. Places like England. The notion that in England the only beverage is lukewarm ale at the pub is woefully outdated. Today, a new industry has taken root. Healthy vineyards in England are producing some of the world's best wines. This sprawling vineyard, with acres and acres of wine grapes ready for harvest, is located in Kent, 40 miles outside of London. It didn't exist 15 years ago, but Great Britain's wine-producing fortunes have been heating up along with the planet. So how has climate change affected the grapes, the wine in this region?
Well, it's completely revolutionized it because...
Stephen Skelton, a member of the highly respected Institute of Masters of Wine, is a viticulturist, an expert in the science, production, and business of wine grapes. I never heard of really good English wine.
No, well, it was very, very rare until we realized that you could grow these classic French champagne varieties in our climate.
This is what they grow in Champagne?
Yeah, and they now grow very, very successfully here in the UK.
What used to be a minute cottage industry run by retirees and gentlemen farmers is today one of the fastest wine-growing regions in the world. This is quite an operation going on.
Oh, it's a big winery.
In 2018, the vintage in England was so bountiful that some vineyards had to scramble to buy vats and tanks to hold it all. Others simply threw grapes away. By the end of the decade, winemakers here will produce an estimated 20 million bottles a year.
No, the foundation of today's industry is the fact that we can grow these varieties which we couldn't grow earlier.
So why couldn't you do it before?
Because the climate was too cold.
You just had to get the temperature up.
Yeah.
So does global warming mean that England now has more days for the grapes to ripen?
Yeah, because we have more days over 85, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. You know, we are in the UK now. We're now where Champagne was 30 or 40 years ago. The climate has shifted in 30 or 40 years upwards, northwards.
So the climate right now, where you and I are sitting in England, is the same as the climate was 40 years ago in
Champagne.
France.
In Champagne, yeah.
He traces the birth of the industry here to 1988.
Then there came two Americans, the Mosses, Stuart and Sandy Moss. They bought an estate called Nye Timber, which is very well known today, and they were the first people to plant a big commercial vineyard.
What did you think?
I thought they were bonkers. I have to say, yeah, I thought they were nuts. I'd heard they were rich Americans up in the hills. He had a fortune apparently from the dental business. And I thought they were mad. Their first wine took a long while to mature. It was 4 years in the making before it was tasted. And then it won this major prize.
Right away, 4 years?
Yeah. And the next year, they won an even bigger prize.
Are you thinking that in a couple of years, the English sparkling wine will be actually better than what they're growing in Champagne?
As they produce 300 million bottles a year. The best is still very, very good. The best is superb. But you could line up the best 10 English sparkling wines against the best 10 champagnes at the same sort of price category. And I can guarantee you that English wines would be in the top half.
To prove his point, he gave us a taste, opening a 10-year-old bottle.
We're going to open it professionally.
Oh, no pop.
No pop.
Look at that. The longer sparkling wine ages, he says, the better. And what you look for is the spritz of fizz on the palate.
You see you've got the bubbles coming from there.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah, you see they're nice and small. And then you nose it. You get a nice yeasty character, baking bread, brioche as we call it. And that's a gorgeous, gorgeous bottle of wine.
Winston Churchill once said, "I could not live without champagne. In victory, I deserve it. In defeat, I need it." Well, nothing would have pleased him more than to hear that because English bubbly is now so good, the House of Taittinger, one of the most prestigious of French champagne makers, is in England. It's now growing 120 acres of grapes and is making sparkling wine near Canterbury in what's known as the Garden of England. Patrick McGrath, who represents Taittinger in Great Britain, persuaded the company to invest here in 2015. Have you brought the grapes from France?
Yeah, the vines were imported from France as tiny little vines. And the first crop we had from them was in 2020. And then that wine will be released at the end of 2024.
You know, in France, part of the problem is not just warming. It's extreme weather conditions. You know, too much flooding, too much frost, too hot. Won't England also have extreme situations like that?
Not at the moment. We're fortunate. You know, England is coming onto the radar as being an area that is warming, but is still moderate in terms of heat compared to South and Central Europe, where it's becoming very, very hot.
Do you think that wine lovers around the world already know that great wines are coming out of England? In other words, is it ooh la la, no more, it's jolly good?
I think it was still at the sort of in the starting block, but certainly yes. Over the last 10 years, from a small base, the sales of English have been growing substantially.
Taittinger's aim is to produce 300,000 bottles a year by 2025. Overall, the English wine industry had $220 million in sales last year. The idea of first-rate English wine would have been laughed at 20 years ago. But a similar migration has happened on the west coast of the United States, where excellent and increasingly popular Pinot and Chardonnay grapes are now found 560 miles north of Napa in Willamette Valley, Oregon.
In the 1950s and 60s, there were really almost no grapes grown in Oregon. And that was because the climates were too cold. And so if you fast forward to where we are today, we're just in a different world.
Greg Jones, a wine climatologist at Southern Oregon University, says grapes are now growing in even more unexpected places.
We have wineries today in Norway, in Quebec, in British Columbia, in Tasmania, and the South Islands of Chile.
Tasmanian wine.
Yeah, Tasmania has really been burgeoning as really a great wine producing region in Australia.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Tasmania is south of Australia.
Sure.
So as winemaking goes north in the northern hemisphere, are you saying it's going south?
South, yes. Yeah.
In the southern hemisphere? So
Yeah, it's going further poleward in both hemispheres, in parts of southern Argentina and Chile, and parts of many parts of northern Europe have started growing grapes.
in real time.
In real time.
In real time. So if you really want a very vivid now example of what's happening due to climate change, go look at wine.
Yeah, you can. People are experimenting at northerly latitudes that I'm amazed that in my career I didn't think I would see it.
In the United Kingdom, as a measure of its acceptance, English sparkling wine has had the royal imprimatur, the Queen serving it at Buckingham Palace. And it was poured at the recent climate change summit in Scotland. Master of Wine Stephen Skelton is bullish on the future. If global warming is intensifying, how worried are you and the other English vintners that it's going to move north beyond your ability to grow
No,
good
I'm
grapes?
not worried at all. No, I mean, the next 40 years are going to be fascinating, I think, because, we're just on the cusp of it being really commercial. Our yield levels are not quite where we want them yet. We would like a little bit more heat.
You might get it.
Yeah.
But eventually,
Who knows? We'll have to start growing oranges and bananas.
I mean, it's a serious question.
Yeah. Personally, I think we will cope with what's being thrown at us.
Some of the winemakers we met are benefiting. Some are suffering. But all are seeing firsthand the message that climate change is delivering.
Wine grapes have often been called the canary in the coal mine.
Climatologist Greg Jones says that's been true since the first wine was made in 6000 BC in Eastern Europe and then spread to ancient Egypt, Greece, and Persia. Kings celebrated their victories with wine, and the Christian world put it at the heart of the Eucharist. Wine history, Jones says, is human history.
Wine touches society in some pretty powerful ways. It's related to civilizations, it's related to history, it's related to geography, it's related to romanticism, art, gastronomy, biology, chemistry. So there's so many things that are tied to it that it becomes something that we can tell the story of climate change through wine pretty easily.
If you want to start a spirited debate at your next holiday meal, ask your guests which country invented wine. France, Italy, or Greece might come to mind. But most scholars say Georgia, the small former Soviet republic, is the birthplace of wine. Scientists say wine residue found on pieces of pottery in Georgia dates back 8,000 years. The country, of nearly 4 million, shares a border with Russia and has survived thousands of years of invasions and wars. Multiple dynasties have come and gone, but somehow many Georgian grapes survived. Tonight, we'll take you on a journey through Georgia to meet the promoters and protectors of Georgia's ancient vines. When you first set foot in Georgia's capital, Tbilisi, she's hard to miss. Perched high up over the city, the towering mother of Georgia wields a sword in her right hand to fend off her enemies and a bowl of wine in her left to welcome friends. That welcome and the country's deep history of winemaking winds through Georgia. The vines of city dwellers cling to tiny balconies. Small family vineyards stretch along the countryside. And larger producers export millions of bottles globally. But to fully understand the rich history of wine in Georgia, we went to the fertile river valley of Kakheti to see the Alaverdi Monastery. At the foot of the Caucasus Mountains, the monastery looks like a fortress. We were invited inside its walls. Our host was Georgian Orthodox Bishop David.
He oversees 3 monks who live on the grounds of the medieval compound. It is a quiet life, committed to God and the godly pursuit of creating a perfect glass of wine.
How many bottles of wine do you make here a year?
20,000 bottles with a maximum of 50,000 bottles. Our wine cellar's capacity is 30 tons of wine.
4 monks, 20,000 bottles. This is a lot of work. Do they ever sleep?
We sleep and work at the same time.
Locals help work the land. But for centuries, the monks have been the guardians of these ancient vines. The monastery dates back to the 6th century. Bishop David told us vines were planted on day 1.
Does making wine make you feel closer to God?
Of course, whenever we are in the vineyard or the wine cellar, we always feel that God is close to us.
Grapes have long held a sacred place in Georgia. In ancient times, wine was considered a divine drink and offered to the gods to win favor. Georgian soldiers tied a piece of grapevine inside the chest of their uniforms to protect them and to assure that if they died in battle, a vine would sprout from their heart. Man was mortal, but Georgian vines eternal. For centuries, the Georgian monks have made wine the same way, producing reds, whites, and even ambers. More on that in a moment. The process is uniquely Georgian. Under the monastery, buried 6 feet deep in the ground, giant clay pots called qvevri are used to ferment, store, and age the wine. It is the traditional way to make wine in Georgia. Many homes have qvevris in their cellar. But today, there are only a handful of qvevri makers who carry on the tradition of hand-building these clay beasts. Some hold nearly 900 gallons of wine. Pressed grapes, skins, stalks, and the juice are all mixed into the qvevri, which is buried in the ground to maintain a constant temperature. Every day during the harvest, the monks make their way through the hallowed halls of the monastery to bless the wine cellar, the grapes, and toast the bounty their vineyards bring. Most of the monks' wine is sold. Some is shared during Sunday communion inside the Alaverdi Cathedral. On this day, a haunting chant stirred inside the cathedral dome. The chant, called "You Are the Vineyard," was written 900 years ago by a former king turned monk to honor Georgia's deep connection to its religion and wine. Lit by candles, it's hard to see the scars of the cathedral. It survived earthquakes and invasions. In an attempt to erase Georgian culture, Russians whitewashed the cathedral interiors in the 20th century, covering up 11th century frescoes, and used the monastery's qvevris to store their gasoline. But miraculously, many of the vines were unharmed. Bishop David says today, 100 grape varieties, some dating back 900 years, are still grown on the monastery's grounds.
And how does the wine taste?
Not to talk about taste, it's better to taste it ourselves.
Sitting near the ancient qvevris, the bishop opened a bottle.
When tasting the qvevri wine for the first time, a person might think they are trying something very different.
Ooh, it does look golden. Amber. Look at that color.
And they say in Georgia that the eye drinks and the eye eats. That's what we have to thankful to God.
There's much to be thankful to God about in this glass.
Of course, it could not be any other way.
Heavenly, with notes of citrus, spices, and honey. It is complex, like the history of Georgia, but in a glass. Georgia's future is also tied to its wines, inspiring chefs like Takuna Gachichi Lodze.
How much is wine a part of the story of this country?
This is, the question, wine or food or wine, It's so together because we don't imagine our everyday life without the wine. And the wine, it's one of the most important part in our history and our culture and in food also.
49-year-old Takuna wasn't supposed to be a chef. While pursuing a psychology degree in New York, she was working at a restaurant and fell in love with both the chef and cooking. She dropped the psych degree and the chef and enrolled in culinary school in Manhattan. A master chef, Takuna is now known as the godmother of Georgia's culinary evolution. She runs the popular Cafe La Terra in the capital of Tbilisi, a restaurant known for its adventuresome menu and wine pairings.
You're credited with revolutionizing Georgian cuisine. How have Georgians responded to that?
I just started to experiment, and then I started to do new recipes based on the traditional ones, and then give this choice, to people. And in the beginning, it was big resistance. The people think you have to keep tradition and untouched. But for me, tradition is always innovation, because every dish was somehow innovative when it started.
Georgia sits at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. A Georgian dinner can look and taste like a trip around the world.
All these influences, starting from China, even from America to Europe, it's gathered here. It was a hub. And that's why our cuisine, traditional cuisine, it was always fusion. So
Georgia was fusion before fusion was fusion.
Exactly. And also because so many invasions, and we were always under the rule of different countries. And this brought these different tastes and the spices and also cooking methods. This is all yours.
Oh, gosh. Perfect.
Culinary clashes are my favorite kind of conflicts to cover. I reported for duty at the dinner table.
It's amazing. Okay. Yes, it's beautiful.
This is our first dish, like an appetizer. It's called phalis, the vegetables with walnuts. We cook in Georgia lots with the walnuts.
Walnuts are one of the workhorses of Georgian cuisine, pulverized and used the same way the French use butter, to make everything creamier. Not surprisingly, grape leaves are also a favorite ingredient.
This is tolma, and you can't imagine any table without this dish.
Our dinner included 5 courses with 6 dishes, each with a different glass of wine.
We have this like a filet mignon.
Do you have a couch that I can recline on?
Yes.
Chef Takuna insisted we taste everything because the wines came from different regions and each had its own unique flavor.
We have so many great winemakers, and it is like a new revolution, and not losing the old traditions. They improve it and then continue doing the great wines.
But there is no wine more distinctly Georgian than this.
You see the difference
of
the
color
colors?
of this.
Yeah. That's why it's called amber.
Not orange.
Yeah, no.
Not orange.
Never orange.
No.
Americans know what to do with red wine, we know what to do with white wine, but if you put an amber wine out, I would not know what I should be serving that with.
Actually, this is what's very interesting. Amber wine, it's like a universal wine. You can drink with the vegetables, you can drink with meat, but this is what makes it unique, You can pair almost with everything.
It's versatile. So I noticed you said you don't like to eat when you're cooking, but you will have a sip, right?
But I drink.
Fine, then you can stay.
2 hours later, the warmth of Georgian hospitality, or perhaps all that wine, washed over us.
It's like a Georgian saying that the guests are from the gods. So you have to treat the guest like you treat the gods.
We usually hear about guests from hell, but guests from the gods sounds a lot better.
In Georgia, we got guests are really from the gods. Cheers.
When we come back, you'll meet a guest who came to Georgia for the culture, food, and wine 25 years ago and never left. Today, he's credited with helping to put Georgian wines on the map and menus around the world. When most of us order wine, we look for a favorite variety, consider the region, the age, or perhaps the cost. But ordering a glass of wine from Georgia can be a bit more complicated. The former Soviet bloc nation is the size of West Virginia, but offers more than 40 varieties of wine, each with a tongue-twisting name from vines centuries old. Still, Georgian wine is gaining popularity beyond the country's borders. Last year, nearly 1.5 million bottles of it were shipped to the United States, an increase of nearly 30% from the previous year. We headed to Georgia's wine country to get a taste for ourselves. Stretched along eastern Georgia, more than 4,000 square miles of vineyards sit at the base of its mountains like a welcome mat. This is the Kakheti region. 3/4 of the grapes used to make wine in Georgia are grown here. In the middle of one of Kakheti's hundreds of vineyards, we met an unlikely ambassador of Georgian wine, an American, 47-year-old Jon Wertheim.
How does an American end up with all of this?
Well, it started with a curiosity for a country that the more I learned about it, the more fascinating it was, and nobody seemed to know anything about it, at least in my world.
Wertheim grew up a world away in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He was studying art in Russia when he visited neighboring Georgia. He liked it so much, he moved here, and in 2006 bought a 62-acre rundown vineyard, hired locals, and started Pheasant's Tears Winery. Georgia is the birthplace of wine. The mild climate and rich soil have made it an ideal place to grow hundreds of varieties of grapes for thousands of years. At one time, the country reportedly had more than 1,400 indigenous grape varieties. Most were wiped out during the Soviet era, when quantity replaced diversity. Jon Wertheim is part of a national effort to recultivate Georgia's ancient vines and bring them back to life.
So in Soviet times, out of 525 varieties, you had roughly 4 or 5 that were the main ones that were commercially available.
So what happened to the rest?
Luckily, Georgians were still growing them in their backyard. They were allowed to have small private plots for their own personal use, and they kept the ancestral varieties going. So when we wanted to start to bring back these ancient varieties together with our friends, that was where we were going. We were going to the individual backyards of farmers that kept growing the varieties that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had kept alive.
Clawing back all of the grape varieties is something Georgians take seriously, a kind of declaration of independence from their former Soviet rulers. In 2014, the Georgian government opened 2 research centers to locate, study, and grow those rare grape vines. Scientists head into the vineyards once a week to gather critical data. DNA of grape leaves is analyzed. Juice is extracted in the field and then tested in labs for disease. Healthy vines are replanted. Today, there are more than 500 native grape varieties growing in Georgia. At Pheasant's Tears, ancient Georgian methods are used to make the wine. Stems, skins, and juice are all mixed together, then poured in giant qvevris buried deep underground and sealed with clay, where the mixture ferments and ages.
This is our lower qvevri level.
Is all the wine here made in qvevris?
Most all of it. There's a couple of wines we'll be tasting later that are on the fresher, lighter side from Western Georgia that we use stainless steel, but everything of structure.
So based on where they are, they have a different taste?
Yeah, if they're in a space that breathes versus a reductive space.
The wine typically remains inside the qvevris for 9 months.
This is where we age the wines.
Then it's bottled and stored in a cellar.
So when are these bottles from?
These are from the last 15 years, but it allows us to understand how the wines develop and what is the most ideal time and for releasing.
Nothing is rushed in Georgia, something we witnessed during lunchtime at the vineyard.
For the harvest of 2023, may it be healthy and long living.
Workers were celebrating the harvest with a traditional Georgian feast called a supra, a lavish meal typically held after weddings, funerals, baptisms, and births. During our lunch, guests broke into song. This is a traditional Georgian folk song, centuries old. A few guests started dancing. Lunch hour stretched into dinner. And then came the toasts.
For children, and for the children that are continuing the tradition.
A half dozen of them before dessert.
With so many toasts, so many songs and dancing, it's amazing anybody eats.
Yeah, but the supras last for quite a long time. If workers go out to work for a few hours in the field and they come back together, they'll have a supra and they'll have toasts about the things that mean the most to them in life. For Georgian winemaking, for the grapes, the history, the vessel, the varieties, and the songs that were built around the feast. Some people have called the Georgian supra an academy, where basically people come together in order to share what they know and to learn from one another.
But Jon Wertheim says schooling the rest of the world on Georgian wines hasn't been so easy. First, there are at least 40 varieties of Georgian wines being served around the world, and even the most sophisticated sommelier might struggle to just pronounce them. Saparavi, Casatelli, and Mitzvani don't exactly roll off the tongue. Then there's the issue of that unusual color, the giant ginger elephant in the glass.
I've noticed a couple people we've spoken to here, when you say orange wine, they shudder a little bit and say, it's amber. Is there any difference?
No, in terms of modern wine syntax, they're synonyms. But I was also a little bit part of the early conversations where when we were talking about orange wine from Georgia, people were worried, is this some sort of citrus concoction being sold outside of Atlanta?
What is it that creates that beautiful color?
So you're basically leaving the must or the juice of the grapes with skins, the pips, and sometimes the stems. Basically extracting both pigment as well as phenolic structure from the skins. So that's changing the flavor as well as the color. But it's also, a lot of our preconceptions can affect how we perceive the wine. Because if you were to show them that same wine in a black glass, they might say, what a delightfully refreshing light red. But when they see it from a white grape, they think, is this somehow a bit clumsy or rustic or why? You know, this doesn't taste like my Sauvignon Blanc that I'm used to drinking.
A little frustrating.
A friend of mine who's a master of wine in London has a beautiful saying that she gave at a conference once. She said, the orange or amber wines of Georgia are not the mean sisters of whites, but the introspective cousins of reds.
But over the last decade, the Georgian family of wines, reds, whites, and even ambers, have been embraced around the globe. Last year, Georgia exported over 140 million bottles of wine to more than 65 countries.
What do you attribute to that kind of growth?
I think in the very beginning, we were walking around with maps and photographs and saying that, no, we're not, swarthy versions of Russians, but Georgians have their own language, their own wine culture, their own culinary culture, history that is very ancient, and, try the wines. But it took a fair amount of effort to get people to give us the benefit of the doubt and even to try.
Over the past decade, more than 2,000 new vineyards have taken root in the country. And last year, Georgian winemakers made more than $100 million.
All of a sudden, it's like watching a black and white picture of a rainbow come to color again. This diversity and expanse of color is coming back to the Georgian table after sleeping for almost a few centuries.
For Georgians, it's another reason to celebrate. For the rest of the world, it's a chance to taste history.
"17 years ago, 60 Minutes first examined the so-called French paradox, which suggested that the French, despite a high-fat diet and high consumption of wine, had a remarkably low incidence of heart disease compared with Americans. Most researchers agreed that there was something in the wine that offered protection. And a few years later, even the highly cautious federal dietary guidelines say that moderate consumption of red wine can be beneficial. Now, scientists across the country have identified a substance in red wine called resveratrol that they believe might do more than just protect the heart, but could, in very high concentrations, significantly extend life by preventing a number of age-related illnesses. If they're right, we all may soon be taking a pill that could give us an extra decade or two of healthy old age.
If the promise holds true, I think this has the chance to change healthcare.
Dr. Christoph Westphal says we all may soon be taking a drug that just might beat the clock, a simple pill that could delay the inevitable.
Our goal is to prevent and forestall many of the diseases that strike us as we reach 50, 60, and 70, all with one pill.
What you're suggesting is there's some kind of rejuvenation drug that turns a 70-year-old into a 35-year-old.
That might be pretty hard to do, but I think if we're on a train heading one direction, we can slow down that train. I think we can slow down these genes that control the aging process.
That quest to put death on hold began in 2003 when Westphal met David Sinclair, a biochemist at Harvard, who was studying the genetic components of aging.
5 years ago, I met David, and he had shown that you could extend lifespan in yeast. That's pretty exciting. Now,
if you happen to be a yeast, it's very exciting. Yeasts are one thing, human beings are more complicated. So Sinclair focused on a gene present in almost all life forms, the sirtuin gene. It's normally inactive, but when it is active, Sinclair believes it triggers a survival mechanism that extends life. Convinced that something in nature could activate that gene, Sinclair randomly tested thousands of compounds. And bingo, he got a hit, resveratrol.
When I Googled this resveratrol, I was shocked to find that red wine was the top hit.
Red wine is brimming with resveratrol. It's found in high concentration in the skin of the grape and seems to play a role in protecting it from invading bacteria and fungi. Were you aware of the research into red wine, that it offered certain health benefits?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's why I almost fell off my chair when the link was made, and I thought that this was a potential explanation for the benefits of red wine.
Convinced they were on the verge of a major scientific breakthrough, Sinclair and Westphal launched Certris, a Cambridge, Massachusetts research company. They, along with a handful of other cutting-edge biotech companies, are developing resveratrol-based drugs that they believe zero in on the longevity gene.
The important news here is not that we found something in red wine. The important thing is that we passed a milestone where we can now make drugs based on this knowledge and potentially slow down aging itself.
Everyone from plastic surgeons to your friendly snake oil salesman have been promising a ticket to eternal youth for some time. So the prospect of a prescription pill based on red wine that could trigger a longevity gene sounds too good to be true. And yet, scientists have actually known for years of one surefire way of doing that. Stay hungry.
Eating a lot of food turns that off. Dieting, extreme dieting, turns it on.
These rhesus monkeys are on a major diet. For nearly 2 decades now, they've been taking in a good 30% fewer calories than their well-fed brothers and sisters. It's feeding time, I gather.
Feeding time.
They're the centerpiece of a National Institutes of Health study at the University of Wisconsin on whether or not CR, calorie restriction, makes them healthier and extends their lives. To maintain their sterile environment, we had to suit up to visit them with Ricky Coleman, the project leader.
These are two of our control animals here.
They are nearing the end of a typical monkey lifespan, about 27 years, and major differences in their overall health are becoming clear.
The difference is really obvious.
Right.
The skinny monkeys actually look younger, their coats are shinier, and fewer have arthritis. And those chunky monkeys, many have diabetes, and a significantly higher number have cancer and heart disease.
Pound for pound, the lighter guys
do better.
Do much better.
Right.
Dr. Richard Weindruck, who heads up the study, believes that calorie restriction turns on these monkeys' genetic survival switch. A hungry life seems to lead to a longer life.
There is an emerging survival advantage for the monkeys on caloric restriction, and 50% of the normally fed animals have died, and maybe 25% of those on caloric restriction.
That's a pretty remarkable number. Surely those are strong indications that a restricted calorie intake among humans would be extremely beneficial.
It appears to support that idea.
But our record as humans in staying on diets is pretty miserable.
And worsening.
So it's a fat chance that we'll all be giving up our passion for greasy junk. We consume tons more calories than we need. But believe it or not, there are some Americans who just revel in their hunger.
I basically just have one meal a day.
Meet the Skinnies, members of CRS, the Calorie Restriction Society, a group that's been severely restricting their calories for years now. They're also part of a Washington University study to see if humans mimic the monkeys. Does this kind of self-denial make them live longer, healthier lives? We joined them for what they call happy hour.
So this is in the spirit of a Bloody Mary.
Though you might regard it as an unhappy hour, a cocktail of low-calorie soup for starters, and walnuts and baby food, green bean puree on flour-free bread to top off this feast fit for a flea.
If I'm hungry, I know, number one, that I have done what I meant to do. I've eaten less than my body thought it wanted.
So far, the participants have lowered their blood pressure, reduced body fat, and lessened risk factors for heart disease, diabetes, and even cancer. And what's more, to one husband anyway, starvation has its sexy side.
To be honest, if you saw her without any clothes, she'd look pretty darn good, like a woman of many, many years younger.
Their emissaries travel the world, spreading the faith and the word. Hunger turns on the survival gene.
I would like to live to be 100.
The Skinnies may not die young, but given their diet, they just might die of boredom. But if the scientists at Certris are on the right track, it could mean forget dieting, forget the sweaty business of working out. Just pop a pill and you are in guilt-free couch potato paradise.
We have a pill that can mimic many of the effects of calorie restriction or exercise.
So one can be very healthy and obese at the same time.
Our goal is healthy individuals, ideally via lifestyle, and if that doesn't work, we believe that we'll have a pill that can mimic that.
A pill that, in effect, diets for you. A pill that turns on the survival gene.
And what we're trying to do with our drugs here is to put the body in a defensive state, to ring the alarm bells and get the body to defend itself. Instead of dieting to set the alarm off, pop a pill.
The pill is a highly concentrated form of resveratrol, a virtual vineyard of healthy living. How much red wine would you have to drink to get the kind of resveratrol that you're using?
The sad news is that you'd need to drink about 1,000 bottles a day of red wine, which I don't recommend.
The pill itself may not extend lifespan, but could prevent the diseases of aging, Alzheimer's, diabetes, heart disease, even cancer.
What we're talking about is activating the body's natural genetic defenses against diseases, and that's very powerful if we can harness that.
Resveratrol has been tested on mice, and the results have been encouraging. In this test video provided by Certris, both of the mice have been fed a high-fat diet for 12 weeks. But when placed on a treadmill, the mouse on the right ran twice as far. he was taking high concentrations of resveratrol.
You have fat mice, and you have fat mice with resveratrol, and the ones that are on resveratrol, they can run twice as far, and they live longer, about 20% longer.
Other studies showed that among mice fed a high-fat diet, those given resveratrol didn't gain as much weight as those not given the drug. Sinclair believes that resveratrol actually changes the physiology of the mice. The proof, he says, is in the post-mortem.
Their organs looked pristine, youthful, fat-free, and their physiology was just like they were dieting, but they were fat.
Convinced they were on the right path, they fast-tracked the drug into human trials on people with untreated diabetes, and the results were impressive. It significantly lowered glucose and insulin levels without the patients changing their diet or taking any other drugs.
Originally, our hope was that you'd be able to prevent diseases of aging. What we ended up seeing is actually you could therapeutically intervene in patients who have diseases of aging, and that was unexpected.
Yeah, the diabetic patients have high blood sugar, and the molecules bring it down. That's treatment, that's not prevention.
Sirtris is now developing what they say is a much more potent synthetic version of resveratrol that will also soon go into human trials, this time on cancer patients.
I keep on thinking, you know, what used to seem like it was science fiction, I actually believe the biology is right, and if we're right, this may be the most important thing that we're going to do in our lives.
Possibly, but it is important to remember that 9 out of 10 drugs that look good in mice ultimately fail in human trials. Still, the speed and results generated by Sirtris and the resveratrol drugs are unusual, and Sinclair believes these drugs will not only keep people living longer, but will keep them healthy longer.
What we're talking about is potentially making a 90-year-old as healthy as a 60-year-old. A 90-year-old can play tennis and see their great-grandkids graduate from college. People will live active, healthy lives and then die quietly in their sleep, and that's really the aim here with these medicines.
Are we on the edge of maintaining active lives into our hundreds, for example?
Well, we've certainly passed a corner in terms of the science, and someone's going to achieve it, and if it's not us, it's going to be someone else.
But the question that most of us want answered is, when do we get this pill?
I would say 5 years, to be conservative, that this will happen within our lifetimes. I'm fairly certain about that.
One measure of the potential of this research, Dr. Sinclair and Dr. Westfall's little startup company was recently bought by the pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline for almost $750 million.
We were nearing last call on the grandest of British institutions, the pub. After enduring for hundreds of years as centers for schmoozing and boozing, pubs were going the way of morning newspapers, afternoon tea, and the whole idea of empire. A range of factors undercut the kind of neighborhood joint where everyone knows your name. Then came COVID, which kept most British pubs closed for more than a year. But in the summer of 2021, the UK reopened, and not unlike an overserved patron, the pub story started to stagger and lurch in an unexpected direction. And as we first reported last year, maybe it's not quite closing time after all. 1,200 plus years old.
Yes. A man walks into a pub. Of course he does. In this case, it's a very old pub. Ye Old Fighting Cocks in St. Albans outside London. Its landlord, or publican, is Christo Tofali.
So your pub is one of dozens in this country that claims to be the oldest ever.
Yeah, absolutely
Make your case,
right.
make your case.
It turns out there's a bit of a misconception which one's the oldest and what the oldest pub is. So we're the oldest pub. The first brick was laid in 793 and the oldest inhabited building in Europe. The Vikings invaded England in the same year. The first brick was laid in 793.
I suspect Vikings would like this place.
They would love this place. Before we go further, let's define our terms. We're not talking about mere bars, or, for the love of God, sports bars. These are pubs, short for public houses. They exist as much for conviviality as for what's on tap. Cold lager, and to the shock of first-timers, warm ale. They've been cornerstones of the culture here for centuries. The writer/comedian Al Murray believes the value proposition goes well beyond beer.
It's a community place, it's a communitarian place, in a way that sitting in your front room watching television just isn't.
I mean, what is it about this culture that has such appeal to you?
To sound sort of idealistic about it, princes and paupers are equally welcome in here. And given that Britain is such a class-ridden society, there are very few places where, you stand at the bar and your money's as good as anyone else's.
You sound like a pub romantic.
I am completely romantic about the idea of pubs.
What?
There is something genuinely beautiful about the idea of somewhere where anyone can go at any time and sit in a corner with their own thoughts and a drink, and it's a beautiful notion.
You don't go to Turner's Old Star for quiet contemplation. One of the last of the so-called boozers in London's East End, it's the heartbeat of the proudly working-class community here.
Put in a day of work, you work hard, you come in, and then you...
Yeah, absolutely. You work hard all day, and then you kind of like... It's just like having a mental shower after a hard day's work, just to kind of wind down. It's like a real-life Cheers, I guess,
They make you feel welcome. They make you feel welcome. We're family. We're family.
Paul and Bernice Drew have run the Old Star for 17 years. They met across the street, got engaged here. They live upstairs. The pub is their living room. The regulars, their oldest friends.
When you say regulars, though, these are really regulars.
Oh, yeah, everybody. Everyone from 0 to 90 enjoys themselves. There's a core of people, I suppose, 10, 15 people, that come in every day, regardless, winter, summer, whenever.
They all come up, have their couple of beers, have a laugh, chew the wag, as they say, and, slag everyone off. They're always having a go at each other.
I hear you say with a real pride, this is proper pub.
It is. It's my pub. That's what we call it, don't we?
No, it's a pub.
We call it a pub.
For centuries, pubs have been as much salon as saloon, as they've taken a stool and watched history and myth unfold. In London Soho, the French house was where bohemians would rub shoulders with resistance leaders. After Paris fell to the Nazis in 1940, Charles de Gaulle, in exile, is said to have written his famous speech to the French Free Forces here. A little further east on the River Thames, legend has it that the 17th century Judge Jeffreys would watch those he sentenced hang as he lunched and sipped ale at the prospect of Whitby.
And then there's the cholera epidemic that gripped London in 1854, killing 550 people in 2 weeks. A local doctor, John Snow, figured out the problem. Contaminated water from a well was spreading the disease, and simply removing the handle from the pump effectively ended the epidemic. John Snow wasn't knighted, but he did receive what might be the next highest British honor.
Christening a pub after someone is an exception. Many pub names read like drunken Mad Libs. Random adjective plus random noun, often an animal. The ape and apple. The snooty fox. The drunken duck. The black dog. For Pete Brown, Britain's leading writer on beer and pubs, these names offer a clue to every establishment's story.
What's going on here?
I mean, it's become one of the quirky aspects of the British pub, but it starts off in a very practical way, which is that most of the population who went to pubs until recently were illiterate. So you couldn't put a name sign up, you had to have a pictorial sign. So you'd pick a picture of something that had some resonance with people. But then some of the ones that you just mentioned, I think it's kind of the pub self-satirizing itself.
And it's not just pub names that veer toward the colorful and eccentric. Just behind London's law courts, and then behind the bar, you'll find the owner, chef, and star performer of the Seven Stars pub, the talented Mrs. Roxy Beaujolais.
Your husband is American.
Yes.
How do you explain what you do to his family?
Well, when I was first introduced to them about 30 years ago, his mother asked me what I did, and I said, I'm a publican. She said, what? Yeah. And my husband dove in and said, no, Mama, not a Republican, a tavern keeper. So,
but what is it about this job that clearly feeds something in you?
I'm good at it, darling. I mean, I'm good at it. I cook. I have a passing interest in the product that I sell myself. I love it.
For the last 25 years,
cheers, good health,
comedian Al Murray has loved playing the figure behind the bar. His alter ego on stages, a head-shaved, over-opinionated blowhard he calls the pub landlord.
We're sensible people in this country, aren't we? Down-to-earth people. Yeah, we never put a man on the moon. Nah, the moon was never going to be part of the British Empire, was it, mate? There's no one to give it back to once we're done with it, was there?
So what is it about that archetype?
He's a know-all who knows nothing. It's a guy who has power but no authority. It's a guy who is writing intellectual checks he can't possibly cash.
Was it mile wide, inch deep?
It's the whole swirl of what happens in a pub. The publican is the conduit, the confessor, the sort of, high priest in a space like this. So all goes through him.
It's all good fun, but as his character suggests, pub culture is, if not eroding, undergoing considerable change. For generations, the number of British pubs has been declining, from 65,000 to fewer than 50,000 in the last 25 years. The causes of death are many: high beer duty, a smoking ban, cheap supermarket lager, people drinking less. Perhaps the biggest culprits? Venture capitalists and developers more interested in a pub's real estate than what's on tap. And then in March 2020 came the hammer blow: COVID-19.
What was it like when this closed for the first time?
So destroying. In business terms, lethal. I still haven't got any words for it, John. We have a passion to open the door every single day.
This wasn't just change the sign on the door. This sounds almost existential.
It's terminal for a lot of pubs.
Even in the worst of times, the Napoleonic Wars, the Spanish flu, pubs did not close. Despite the bombings and the Blitz, Churchill insisted that pubs remain open. How bad can things be if we can still pull a pint?
But this is just a little story to show that the spirit of the pubs is excellent. The house is bombed, they carry on outside.
The lockdown gave Britain a glimpse of a future without pubs. For months, the cobbled streets where Dickens once walked, silent. The taverns where Chaucer or Shakespeare might have drunk, empty. Millions of barrels of beer literally down the drain.
What does this country stand to lose if pubs diminish?
I think part of its identity, we celebrate our nationality in a very quiet way, in a very modest way. And the pub is the perfect example of that. We're proud of the pub. And if it was taken away from us, I think we'd lose something of what defines us as a nation.
It's not flag-waving jingoism, but coming in here is sort of an act of patriotism, you're saying?
It's just coming in and just going, yeah, I'll have another pint, thank you.
Coming out of lockdown, the pint-wielding patriots believed more than ever that the pub is an institution worth saving.
Saving the traditional pub, is that nostalgia for a Britain that may no longer exist?
Oh, there are so many Britons that may no longer exist, but the one that's worth saving is the pub, surely. I mean, we don't need a navy anymore, do we? We need pubs.
In a changing Britain, nostalgia can reside at the bottom of a glass. In the oh-so-English village of Aldworth in Berkshire, you'll find just a cricket green, a church, a few houses, and a pub resistant to time. The Bell Inn has been in the family of Heather Macaulay for 200 years. She was born in the pub, and now, at age 85, runs it with her son Hugh.
And would you like fresh onion and tomato on the side as well?
How many generations in these 200 years?
We go, there's James and Hugh and Thomas and Ronald, and then me, 5, I suppose.
We've talked to some pub owners who've said they felt this pressure to evolve and they're trying gourmet food and DJs and technology.
Here, no. We are plain, simple. That's how we survive. That's how we're going to survive. I don't think we'll ever be putting TVs in here somehow.
Oh, no.
No.
Well, I don't even have a mobile phone.
Pubs like the Bell Inns and the Old Stars have done what they've always done, served their communities. But where does the rest of the country fit in? Nigerian-born Clement Ogbenaya is proud owner of the Prince of Peckham in South London. He has taken the magic of the pub and adapted it to multicultural 21st century Britain.
You hear the word pub 20 years ago, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking I'm not going there.
So play that out for me. You walk into a conventional pub and what happens?
Think of Clint Eastwood in a Western movie. It's like everyone looks at the door, swinging. Who's that guy? That's how I felt in some pubs I walked in.
Piano stops playing.
Absolutely, absolutely.
4 years ago, Clement bought up a neighborhood joint destined to be turned into an apartment block or a mini market.
Pubs play a massive part in representing the communities, representing the underrepresented, the marginalized, and giving them a space, giving them somewhere where they can actually be, they can congregate, they can share ideas.
When kids today hear the word pub, what do you want them to think?
I want them to think that's a space for me. That's a space where I can be. That's a space where I can celebrate. That's a space where I can hang out, I can laugh, I can mourn.
That's what you're going for when you open this place.
Yeah, I just love seeing the melting pot that is London reflected in this pub.
And herein might lie the key to the pub's survival. Cater to an evolving and ever-changing Britain, and beer and good cheer might well flow in equal measure. Those pints, after all, aren't going to drink themselves.